It's for causal inference on digital platforms.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to my talk. I'm going to be speaking about causal inference on digital platforms. And the broader framing for this talk is that there are all these causal stories about algorithmic moderation on social platforms that I'm sure you've heard, all these terms like filter bubbles, echo chambers, political polarization, radicalization, amplification, and misinformation, all these things. And if you think about it, and that's relevant for this workshop, these are all what I call causal stories, right? They stipulate that there's some kind of mechanism at play, some kind of dynamic mechanism by which some kind of algorithmic curation or moderation leads to some, social outcome that we're concerned with, right? And so these are urgent problems. They're fiercely debated, today. And what's worrisome is that in many cases we have very limited sort of theoretical understanding about these phenomena, and also very limited empirical information of how they occur and where they occur. So I'm not going to, solve all these issues in this talk. Instead, I'll tell you sort of about two projects I did at Twitter, which maybe stand in for this broader set of problems that I'm interested in. Okay, so here are the two projects. One of them is algorithmic amplification of politics on Twitter. Appeared at PNAS earlier this year. It was led by Ferenc Fuzar, Sofia Irakatena, Connor O'Brien, Luca Belli, Andrei Schleicher, Annie Schleicher, who were all at Twitter at the time. So Ferenc did, the bulk of the work and is put in a whole lot of effort. I'm mostly just reporting on these interesting findings. And the other project was done by Smitha Milley and Luca Belli, or joint work with them on causal inference and how it sort of fails to, or struggle with, human agency on online platforms. And I'll talk about these two projects and how they're related and how they give us sort of a sense of what the broader challenges are for applying causal inference to social platforms and the issues you're going to run into. Okay. And this is based on, some time I spent at Twitter between 2019 and 2021 and work I did there. Okay, so feel free to stop me if there are any questions. It's probably going to be a relatively short talk. I'm not going to spend all the 40 minutes, so there should be some discussion. Okay, so let's start with Twitter's home timeline. Okay, so I told you these are projects that were done at Twitter. When you open up Twitter, you probably see tweets like these. How many of you use Twitter? This is an academic crowd, probably. Okay, this is like some reporting bias here. People don't want to, out themselves, but I feel like everyone probably has a secret Twitter account and is checking stuff. And so the home timeline is what you see when you log on. So when you either use the web interface or the cell phone client, you see like a stream of tweets. And this stream of tweets has been personally or sort of algorithmically ranked on a personalized manner since 2016. So in 2016, Twitter announced a big change by which they were going to re-rank or algorithmically rank your home timeline based on some machine learning model, okay, trained on various signals, various data sources. And it's really sort of like the kitchen sink approach to these problems, like the way you would expect it. You sort of throw in all the signals you have and you try to get some kind of relevant ranking, okay? And so before that, it was basically a reverse chronological ordering. So you'd see the most recent tweets first from the people you followed, plus some filtering. So there were even on the reverse chronological timeline, there are some algorithms at play, but it's not really like a machine learning thing, or it's less of a machine learning thing than the personalized ranking that has been there since 2016, okay? And ever since, there has been an intense debate about the effects of algorithmic ranking and algorithmic moderation on Twitter, right? And who benefits from it and who's silenced by it and what's going on, especially in the political context, okay? So who's benefiting from the algorithmic timeline? 2016, was a lot of political events obviously unfolded. And, there has been a lot of, discussion on what this algorithmic timeline did to sort of the political conversation on Twitter. There was an interesting article in The Economist a year and a half ago that ran an experiment where they looked at tweets by Donald Trump and they compared how well these tweets were faring on reverse chronological timelines compared with algorithmically ranked timelines. And they found that, actually the algorithmic ranking did not seem to sort of suppress tweets by Donald Trump or even de-amplify them anyway. But it did sort of respond to what they said were sort of more inflammatory tweets. So they found that the algorithmic timeline seemed to like sort of emphasize or highlight, re-rank, things that were more emotional or inflammatory.
Did they do that by going to the paths? Like how did?
No, they just monitored. They said like an account. So Twitter lets you opt out of the algorithmic timeline. So they set up multiple accounts, one with a reverse chronological timeline and one with like the algorithmic timeline. And then they just looked at what they saw. So they would log on with both accounts and they would just count basically. So it was a little bit anecdotal, like small data, but it was an interesting idea. Okay. There's lots of other research on like this claim that, conservatives are silenced. And there's also much research on like the differences between like, how different political parties use Twitter. So there's a lot of or growing understanding that different political actors utilize Twitter differently and sort of, for their own purposes, strategize on it differently. Okay, so we wanted to know does algorithmic personalization cause an advantage along established political lines? Does it favor the right or the left or more radical positions, more central positions? Who actually benefits from this? Okay. And what we used for addressing this question or getting some insights on it was an experimental setup that started at Twitter in 2016. That was set up by the home timelines team at Twitter. And wisely, when they set up this new algorithmic timeline, they set aside a control group of 1% of all global users that were assigned like a reverse chronological timeline. So 1% of Twitter users are seeing a reverse chronological timeline, possibly without knowing it. And I like to think that some people who complain about the algorithm are in the control group. That's the control group. And the treatment group was like another set of 4% of all global users randomly assigned to the algorithmically ranked group. That's just the same treatment that everyone gets. So basically think of like the treatment group as everyone except for the control group. But for some technical purposes, they're like the treatment group is a subsample of all users. Okay. And obviously, Twitter, was interested in this kind of setup to sort of monitor the algorithmic timeline for product improvement, see how well certain things are working, if like engagement's going up on the algorithmic timeline or down. So they're monitoring various metrics, based on this randomized experiment. Okay. So if you think about this kind of setup, right, as like causal inference experts, there are a few things you'll notice right away that make this like a little bit of an idiosyncratic setup. One of them is, of course, that you have lots of network effects. That's kind of unavoidable. So people interact. In particular, what's notable is that the control group still sees mostly content written by non-control users. So if you have a reverse chronological timeline, you're still seeing like tweets authored by people who consume an algorithmically ranked timeline. So in a sense, you're still like experiencing indirect effects of algorithmic curation and moderation. Okay. So that's like sort of an effect that's at play. Whether you want these network effects or not depends on what question you want to answer, right? Sometimes the network effects is exactly what you care about. Sometimes you would sort of like to, have an effect that sort of is gets rid of these effects. Okay. The other thing that's sort of annoying a little bit is that the treatment changes over time. Okay. So the algorithmic timeline, of course, is subject to like a lot of refinement and tweaking and improvements. And so Twitter continues to update the algorithm all the time. And so it's not like one constant treatment. It's not the same treatment. Okay, so the people that are in the treatment group do get algorithmic updates. It's not like the product is frozen in time. And that's also true for the control group. Okay, so even the control group changes over time. For instance, when it comes to things like safety filters, right? So things like, suppressing abusive content, things that Twitter considers a matter of safety, that they will also do on like the control group. Okay. And so, yeah, as I said, Twitter used the experimental setup for tweaking the platform. So there's kind of like an effect here whereby measurements on this like, control group feed into updates to the treatment. Okay, so it's a little bit of a thingy. So like, measurements at time t influence treatment at time t+1. Okay, so what you get from this kind of experiment is what I call hodgepodge causal effects. Which is, first of all, it is a causal effect of sorts because you break randomization, you break confounding through randomization, you still randomize. So there's like no way that something like, influenced assignment into control or treatment group. Okay, but On top of that, all mediators are at play. Sort of all mechanisms that you can imagine on the platform are simultaneously at play. Okay, and this is what I call the hodgepodge. So all the network effects are active. How well different actors strategically respond to the algorithmic timeline is an important effect. Like, you know, there's people who see how this thing works and will like adapt to it. And then there's Twitter's own optimizations based on the setup. Okay, so the picture is something like this. There are network effects, so you have to sort of talk about treatment to user I and outcome for user I. You break confounding, so there's no possible way that like there's some kind of variable X that influences both treatment for user I and outcome for user I. But there are all sorts of different mechanisms, right? And these different mechanisms, these different mediators do have different political, moral, and sociological significance, right? It depends on what question you want to answer. If you want to say that, you know, Twitter did something wrong, you might be interested in one particular mechanism. If you want to say something else, then you know, you might be interested in a different mechanism. Okay, so this is something that in this talk we'll like lump together. So the numbers you're going to see are sort of all mediators at play simultaneously. Okay. So what we ended up measuring is a notion called algorithmic amplification. Okay, so let me tell you what algorithmic amplification is. It's a property of a set of tweets with respect to a set of users. And we define something called the amplification ratio. And it's just the number of treatment users in U who encountered a tweet in the set T, divided by the number of control users in the set of users U who encountered a tweet in T. So it's roughly the exposure that that the tweets in T are getting among the users U in treatment, divided, normalized by the exposure that the tweets are getting in the control group within U. Okay, as an example, you could take U, and this is usually how we instantiate this. We take U to be, let's say, all German Twitter users. Okay, T is all the tweets, you know, sent by some, you know, politicians of some particular political party. In this case, you know, let's say CDU, some German party, in some time window. And the time window of our study was actually April 1st, 2020 through August 15th, 2020. So we generally look at tweets in that range, and we vary this like set of users by like particular countries. And we vary the set of tweets by like, you know, different politicians, different news sources, different parties, and so on. Okay.
You actually mean fraction of users?
Good catch. So yeah, so as I said, the treatment group's like 4 times as large as like the control group. So if you just divide, you would get like weird numbers. So we actually like divide, you know, normalize and subtract a little bit so that 0% is equal proportion. Okay. So, you know, an amplification ratio of 0% corresponds to a random user from treatment is just as likely to see a tweet in T as a random user in control. Okay, so this is kind of how I want you to interpret this. So what's your, like, if you're in treatment, how likely are you to go to see a tweet in T compared with when you're in control? Okay. There's also a technical issue here for like what it means to see a tweet, right? And what we're counting are so-called linger impressions. That's a technical term for like a tweet that was visible on your screen by more than half for more than some number of milliseconds. Okay, so there's some technical definition, and it's like what Twitter considers to be like an actual impression. Like not just, you didn't just like scroll over it, but somehow you lingered on it, and there's like some kind of evidence that you actually perceived it. Okay, so yeah. So generally, amplification ratio, 0 means same in treatment and control. 50% means like treatment is getting like a 50% advantage in seeing the tweet. 100% is like twice as likely, and so on. Okay, so that's the scale of things. Okay, does it make sense? So here are some, or here's the scope of the algorithmic audit that we ended up doing. So we looked at millions of tweets from individual politicians sent out in the year 2020. And we did kind of a fine-grained analysis of major political parties in 7 countries. The countries are Canada, France, Germany, Japan, Spain, United Kingdom, and United States. So we looked at all these countries and major politicians or politicians and major parties in those countries. And also for the United States specifically, we looked at 6.2 million news articles that were shared. So 6.2 million shares of news articles in the United States. And again, it's the study period was roughly April through August 2020. Okay. And so here's like the typical kind of picture we find. Here's a summary of you know, algorithmic amplification for each party, and in, you know, these 7 countries. So on the the y-axis is the amplification ratio, and it's called group amplification because we look at the party as a whole. On the x-axis, you have various parties in different countries, so you'll recognize some of them in the U.S. It's House Democrats and House Republicans, Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans, and then in all the other countries, we try to sort of look at the major parties. We pulled some data on trying to find political affiliations and try to find all the politicians that have Twitter accounts, and so then we were able to compute or look at the tweets that they send and compute their amplification ratio. What you're seeing is that across the board, politics generally gets a lift on the algorithmic timeline. So all the amplification ratios are greater than 0. The Canada Liberals are sort of the lowest, but even they get a little bit of a lift. And you can look at it yourself, whichever country you prefer to look at. I think let's start over here. One interesting thing that we saw in Germany is, for instance, that the center parties, so center left, SPD, and center right, CDU, are particularly amplified, whereas the more extreme parties, the far left, Die Linke, and the far right, AfD, are less amplified relative to the center parties. So it's actually, again, sort of conventional wisdom in Germany, at least, that the center gets more political or more algorithmic amplification than the extremes. But what we're also seeing is that across the board, the right-leaning parties are faring pretty well. So there's generally, the UK Conservatives, for example, in the US, there's a slight benefit for Republicans. And we're seeing that across the board, right-leaning parties are doing a little bit better in terms of algorithmic amplification. That's also shown by this plot in particular, where you look at algorithmic amplification of left-wing parties on, on the x-axis compared with right-wing parties on the y-axis. So the main diagonal would be equal amplification. And then you see in the United States, or basically you see in all countries except for Germany, that you tend to be algorithmic amplification tends to be in the upper left quadrant, meaning that there is a sort of consistently higher algorithmic amplification for right-leaning parties. Okay. We also split this up in more detail for House and Senate politicians by individuals. So this is where we look at individual politicians' accounts. And we look at the distribution of these amplification ratios. And so the mean and standard deviation are not that different in the US and also not that different in Canada. But the Republican or the conservative parties tend to have a longer tail towards higher amplification ratios.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
A technical question? I'm still confused about what this scale is. Is this a log scale?
No.
Why is 0? 0 is 1 to 1.
0 is 1 to 1. Yeah.
So what is 100?
100 is double. 100 is 2.
And 200 is.
200 is I guess. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, 200 is just
Double 100.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess that's what it is. Yeah.
It doesn't really matter.
No, you're right.
Qualitatively,
Now
it
you
doesn't
also have me confused. Okay. No logs though. It's just subtracting and dividing. So I guess. No, so 200 is just factor 3. Okay, so yeah, no, it's 100 is factor 2, 200 is factor 3, 400 is factor 300 is factor 4, and so on. Yeah.
Is there any significance to the fact that everything was amplified?
Yeah, I think that's one definitely one I think interesting finding is that politics as a subject is sort of or as a topic on the timeline is strongly amplified by the algorithm.
But of course, this couldn't happen across the board for all topics, right? So somehow there's something.
There's other topics that will suffer. Yeah, so you could imagine that obviously politicians and news media reporting on politics have an interest in getting a tweet seen, right? So you could also imagine that these are tweets that are particularly engaging that get sort of rank higher. Right?
Does this include promoted tweets and stuff like that?
No. So promoted tweets show up on both the control and the treatment group and are excluded from the study. Yeah.
Is there control group or if the people in the treatment group spend more time on Twitter and see more things, would that be taken? Like, is it possible that everything could be amplified because like it works so well in engagement?
That's also true. Yeah. So there's also user active minutes. And so the question is like, is everything amplified for the algorithmic timeline? And it's true that the user active minutes is higher on the algorithmic timeline. Not this much to explain, like this is not like sort of the baseline list that everything gets, but yes, there's generally more engagement and more seen tweets on the algorithm timeline. So that's a big point. Yeah. So we also looked at news sources, as I said, and there are, you can argue about the classification of news sources into left-leaning and right-leaning. That's certainly a controversial classification, but there are two independent media rating organizations, AllSides and Ad Fontes, who provide media ratings. So they'll tell you like a score between right and left for different news sources. And you can agree or disagree with this rating, but it's just sort of, we ran both of these just to give you a sense of where things are. And here you can sort of see what's happening. Pick your favorite news source here and see where it is. So
at least the bottom graph kind of looks like they all get amplified the same amount, more or less. Am I reading that? How should I be interpreting that? Like,
yeah, the
just my eye
bottom,
looks like that.
that's right. According to the bottom classification, there's no, except for like far left, maybe have any. So these are not error bars. These are just like, they're multiple news, like they're multiple media. This is the range for the different, so this is this is not, don't think of this as like an error bar for statistical estimate. This is the standard deviation among the news sources, right? So it is true that the far left news sources, according to Ad Fontes, get amplified less than the far right news sources, according to Ad Fontes. But yeah, we're, for example, not seeing that, again, here, this picture, that we're not seeing that like extreme is doing better than center. Okay. So necessarily. Okay.
Yeah, you look at this immense engagement thing. Could the right be getting more engaged on Twitter across this time period?
Yeah. So one thing that certainly could be true is that the right is simply better at like utilizing the algorithm timeline, and it's like creating more engaging tweets.
But across areas, I mean, just people in that might be not just in politics. It could.
Like,
I mean, I wouldn't know we wouldn't know from this data, but maybe just overall they're more engaged on Twitter, got more into their lives, as opposed to they're more engaged with the political issues on Twitter.
So it's a little bit different. So there's what algorithmic amplification measures is how often tweets are seen of an individual. Like if you have a politician, how often are their tweets seen, right? So it's certainly like Twitter on the whole is like left-leaning, like has more Democratic users than Republican users. So like your tweets are also seen not just in your own political, sphere, right? So it probably must mean that the right is also like better able to have their tweets engage outside their political circles. For instance, by creating outrage or something like that. That's a mechanism that will go over like, will create engagement outside their own political group, right? So I guess maybe I'm not understanding your question, but the way I thought is that I thought the question you were asked was, are Republicans just more engaged on Twitter?
On the algorithmic timeline, maybe was more successful at engaging that section of the population on Twitter and increasing evidence online, which is probably Twitter's goal in the first place for all of these.
Right. So yeah, and the distinction I want to make is like, are authors more engaging, or is the audience more engaged? Right, and that's an important difference, right? So yeah, it's true that if your audience is more engaged, that can lead to amplification, but you also have to sort of like, to really benefit from, or to really have like a lot of reach, you probably also need to engage users that are not just like, in your own group. Yeah.
Just clarification. So any news source that's to the left of zero has a real problem. Is that right in terms of getting their message out?
Yeah, to the left of zero, you're, you could even ask like, how, this is a good question, like, So first of all, yes, less than zero means you're being like, the algorithmic timeline is not helping you. It's like, giving you a bit of a penalty. And it's a question of like how much, like how significant are these differences for like long-term, benefit, right? Like if you imagine like there's a small penalty, but it kind of applies every day, right? It compounds into like a much greater disadvantage, right? And so there's sort of a question of, do you think that these differences kind of compound over time? And so, yeah, but I do think like, at least for, I mean, what you're seeing here, let's say LA Times compared to New York Post, that's a huge difference, of course.
And it's just political tweets or?
Yeah, like political articles. Yeah. So this is like shares of political news sources. Cool. Yeah. So let's just summarize these discussion points. Across 7 countries, we saw that right-wing parties benefit as much and often much more than from algorithmic personalization than left-wing parties. US media outlets with a right-leaning bias are amplified marginally more. And among individual politicians, party membership, there are differences among individual politicians, but party membership is not sort of strongly associated with amplification. Okay. So they're very successful individual politicians across the spectrum. So again, the study does not pin down mechanisms behind the effect. It's this kind of hodgepodge causal effect. And one mechanism that you might sort of expect that is at play here is that different parties utilize Twitter differently and are differently like successful to different degrees in how they kind of strategize on Twitter and how they use it for political activism. Okay. And what we're interested in is kind of the relative differences among parties and politicians. And it does not answer the question of like whether we'd be better off with a chronological timeline for everyone. Okay, so this comes up a lot. Is like, does it mean we should turn off the algorithmic timeline? Maybe, but we don't have the counterfactual of like what would a world look like with only like chronological timelines, because then you could still expect like you can also game the chronological timelines, right? And that's like would lead to a different strategy space, but you might see different effects in that case. So we don't have this counterfactual, and that's not the question we're sort of fundamentally trying to get at. That makes sense? Okay, cool. So I'm going to get into like kind of a complementary problem with causal inference on social platforms. And this comes up a lot around the issue of like user choice and user agency.
Can I ask a
Yeah,
question about
sure.
that? So this is a real experiment that's actually been run, and we've seen a lot of like methodology type talks, but often when I see a real experiment being run, I often wonder like why we ran the experiment. So I guess if you're able to share and talk with us about this, like I guess we're measuring amplification of this like algorithm as measured in this way, and we see lots of things. But what is Twitter going to do with this? Like, why? What's their end goal with knowing this?
So I think the first goal. That's a good question. So I guess the first goal was to just figure out like what's going on, right? Because like there have been all these speculations about like who benefits from the algorithmic timeline, and just wanted to get some quantitative, empirical sort of evidence out there of what is actually happening. And some things were sort of what we expected, some things were not what we expected. So I think it clarified a lot on that. There's like remains like a normative question of like what do we do with this now? Like, does it mean we should like move away from algorithmic curation, or like should we somehow like adjust for it, right, and so on. And yeah, those are part of what I consider like ongoing questions, right? So yeah.
Yeah, one thing it makes me feel like is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, more of a comment that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is like, I would guess that what might be going on, or what people might be wanting to do is, okay, I, Twitter, the company, am getting lots of negative feedback. People say, oh, you're like silencing conservative voices, or you're silencing the like radical leftist, but you're silencing. Right. And I run this experiment and I say, nope, the data shows that I'm amplifying you all in the same way. Like I just wash my hands and I'm like, hey, we're treating you all kind of the same.
Yeah.
But there's still this social unrest maybe. And it feels like, I don't know does this experiment try to like help us address, I mean, I guess you just said not so much, but how does that fit into because the picture, the way I see it fitting in is kind of like saying, well, I'm not responsible for any of this. Is that how I should be reading it, or what's a more optimistic read as well?
So I think, first of all, that's like for us to decide, right? Like the data, like I think, these findings are out there, right? Like now there can be a conversation about like, what should we hold, Twitter accountable for, right? And I think hopefully these things will make that conversation easier, or at least like provide sort of concrete input into it. You can also like look at the communication that Twitter had around these topics and see how you feel about this, right? And what they do with it. I think in the short term, I don't think there's anything to do with this, right? I think they were just gonna continue to build their algorithmic timeline. I don't think they saw this as like sort of, relieving them of like pressure from like the public on this topic. I don't think that was the takeaway, because like in some sense these findings are rather uncomfortable, right? So I don't think they were greatly relieved to see this. But that's sort of me speculating. I'm not speaking on behalf of like the leadership. But,
Much worse. Right?
huh?
Could have been much worse.
Could have been much worse, yeah. Or but yeah, this is like a conversation that now should happen, right? And like, we're, hoping that the facts being out there will make it easier.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about the individual politicians part of it? I wonder whether sort of posting it at the like party level might hide sort of amplification of like, Marjorie Taylor Greene or more.
Oh yeah. So you can also look at if you look at the paper, we highlighted like specific politicians. There are certainly like some extremely successful politicians on Twitter, right? Like so there are people that utilize Twitter very successfully, including like, for instance, Donald Trump, who's like very successful utilizing Twitter by all measures. So you can look at the individual like data for these politicians, like it's available. So all the data is out there. You can look up the politicians that you want and see for them.
I think the very early question is just like, do the same conclusions hold if you look at like the median?
I can't hear your
Oh,
voice.
sorry.
Yeah.
Do the same conclusions hold if you look at the median instead of the mean, like right versus left? Like,
So yeah, there's like kind of an interesting question when you group up things, right? There's always like some flexibility you have. One of them, first of all, you could look at daily amplification ratios and average them out, or take like the median daily thing, or you could throw all the tweets together and then do that, right? So what we did is we threw all the tweets together and then averaged. And I think when you throw all the tweets together and average is not so different from the median. I think could be more different is if you look at like, if you like first compute the daily amplification ratios and then like mean versus median might be more different. All right, so let me move on. We can maybe if there's more time, we'll talk about this more at the end. So the second sort of complementary topic I want to talk about is the sort of problem of user agency and control on social platforms. And it engages with this common response that people have to algorithm moderation. So they look at findings like these and they're like, oh, we don't know what these algorithmic timelines do. We don't know what algorithm moderation does. So let's just give users all sorts of controls. Let's give them all sorts of settings that they can play with. They can turn things on and off and see, like tailor their own experience, right? And so Twitter, like many other social platforms, offers numerous such controls. Just to give you some sense, you can like personalize your push notifications, like the notifications on your cell phone, email notifications. You can turn that on or off. You can also turn the algorithmic timeline that I just talked about on or off. You can go to the reverse chronological timeline if you want. And you can also turn off like all sorts of like filters, like the quality filter, and you can have them like show you all the tweets and not just things they think are, meeting some quality bar. Yeah.
What fraction of people have turned the algorithmic timeline off?
Yeah, that's something I should know. We do know, and it's probably even in the paper. But it's a small fraction. Like for like most of these user controls, where it's definitely like less than 10% ever look at their settings tab in Twitter and like start tinkering with it. And it's actually like there is I went down that rabbit hole once. There's all sorts of settings, but it's kind of hard to get to, and like I don't even know which settings I have enabled or disabled. So. I might be on the reverse chronological timeline and So yeah, but yeah, so a few people, like let's say somewhere between 1% and 10% is probably like what we're talking about for these controls. So yeah, all of these are they're treatment by default, opt-in by default, and users can opt out. Okay. And so now when you're trying to understand the causal effects of these user agencies, so what users choose to toggle and whatnot, there's kind of this interesting situation that because people can opt out, you're getting data about both treatment and control, right? So you have the default as opt-in, but some people opt out, of course, by self-selection, but some people do opt out. So in principle, you get the setup for kind of like observational causal designs where you have like both treatment and control users. And if you could somehow deconfound, the opt-out, then you would have a causal inference design that you could play with. So there's this question of, can we estimate the causal effect of opt-in of treatment from observational data that we have? And like sort of look at it differently, do randomized experiments such as A/B tests, anticipate the effect that opt-out has on those who choose to do so, right? Let's say we do like a new, we want to set, create a new setting, and we run an A/B test to see what it does. Does that actually anticipate the effect it has on people who will then opt out, right? Which is not necessarily clear when you run an A/B test. So both of these questions are really relevant because a positive answer to number one would allow you to avoid costly and possibly also unethical randomized experiments, right? If you do something like the quality filter, for example, or like an abuse filter, like something that like filters out like abusive tweets, let's say, it's not clear whether randomizing that, like doing an A/B test, is ethical. Some people might have concerns with it. So you prefer to kind of like do an observational design where you don't have to become active and you just work from the data you have anyway. And if you get a positive answer to number two, then you could like more easily test the effects that this actually has on users, right? And you could more easily like determine what's going to happen when you set up all these controls, right? Good. So what we did is we wanted to know how well we wanted to answer these questions. So how well observational designs work for getting at these causal effects. And to do that, we used what is called a within designs or within study comparison, where you run a randomized controlled trial or A/B test, where you set up a control group that never receives treatment, so is always opt out. And there's a treatment group that gets opted in, that gets the treatment, but they're allowed to opt out. So the treatment group can opt out. So you have this sort of this one-sided compliance where like in the treatment group, people can opt out on their own. And then you run like an observational study within the treatment group among the exposed and the unexposed group. Okay. And this was inspired by a paper that I really like by Gordon et al. From 2019 that actually showed that in the context of targeted advertising, observational designs do fairly poorly compared with experimental trials when it comes to like determining the effects of ads. Okay, so they also use this kind of design to show that observational methods don't do that well. So what did we do? We did 4 large-scale such within study comparisons of experimental and observational causal inference on Twitter. We looked at 4 different user settings, the ones I mentioned: push notifications, email notifications, algorithmic timeline, and quality filter. And we used 4 standard observational methods to see how they work. And they're kind of like, sort of I don't have them here, but it's like inverse propensity scores and like adjustment and like a few standard things. And so what we found is that like the observational methods do very poorly. Okay, so on the bottom here, the RCT is the randomized controlled trial. The y-axis is always the outcome that we looked at. In 3 cases, just user minutes on the platform, how much time people spend on the platform. And then the next 4 things are just the observational methods. And you can see that in like 3 out of 4 cases, the observational methods even got the sign wrong of the causal effect. So, you can see that, for instance, if you turn off or if you turn on the algorithmic timeline, this also goes back to a question earlier. If you turn on the algorithmic timeline, you see like a big boost in like time spent on the platform, right? So the algorithmic timeline boosts engagement when you run an RCT. When you use any of these observational methods, based on who chooses to see the reverse chronological timeline, you get to come away with the impression that it decreases engagement. And why is that? Because people who opt out of the algorithmic timeline Well, they're really like, maybe they're really power users who have like a very specific way of using Twitter. They're really opposed to like any kind of algorithmic intervention. They really want to see it in a certain way, and they have really strong opinions about it. So once they turn it off, they're like, ah, this is great, and then they spend a lot of time on Twitter, right? So yeah, and like none of these observational designs were able to kind of deconfound that effect, right? So they all sort of come away with the wrong impression. In the case of quality filter, the sign is right, but like the magnitude is completely wrong. Yeah, just for completeness. So RCT is the experimental data, or the experiment, the randomized control trial. And then there's some like things that various observational methods. What's more important is what did we do to try to deconfound or like remove confounders? And it didn't work, as you can see. But basically, so the issue is something like this, right? So you have the user who can choose to opt in or opt out, and you have some outcome, like minutes spent on the platform. And what we did is we adjusted for 14 available variables about the user that could be confounding behavior, okay? And we thought about what is kind of like confounding behavior at play here. The first thing we imagined is whether or not you're a power user, right? If you have like very strong opinions about how Twitter should work, like you spend a lot of time on the platform and you play around with these settings. So we adjusted for things that tell you whether somebody is a power user, like number of minutes you spend on Twitter, how old your account is, how many number of followers you have, how many people you follow, etc. So that's one category of features we try to use as like control variables. We also looked at things like privacy sensitive. Are you turning off things because you have your account protected, or you don't want your tweets seen, or you don't want targeted ads, things like this. And we also looked at whether your account has some issues, like it's restricted, it was blocked or whatever, right? And none of them worked, okay? So in all cases, there are too many other things about the user that kind of give them agency, right? There's too much complexity in this link from user to treatment to kind of like, control it away, okay? So what drives user choice is kind of poorly described by these features that we have, right? And so we weren't able to like get a design that works. But of course, this is just like us, it's impossible to rule out that some observational design might work, right? It could be that like, if you find some like extremely clever design that might work, but at least spending some time on it, we're unable to do anything that works at all.
Do you think it's problem from outliers, or is it more uniformly spread out?
Was a problem with outliers. So it's certainly a problem, first of all, with like the selection bias being extremely strong, right? Like very few people use these controls. And so that makes deconfounding like much harder, but like there's a strong selection bias. Like, there's really, for you to go out and like toggle these settings, a lot of stuff has to happen. And that's kind of hard to capture with these features that you have. That's maybe related to outliers. So the people who opt out are kind of outliers in that sense. So yeah. So this came.
Can I ask real fast?
Yeah,
what
sure.
was the type of randomization? Because a lot of times I think that if interference is to blame for this big difference here, I think that maybe you can curb the effect of interference by doing special types of randomization.
Yeah.
What type of randomization was used in the RCT? Was it a Bernoulli thing, or was it kind of a cluster based on interference, or?
Yeah, so this one, I'm less worried about interference because these are relatively small RCTs, right? Like with the algorithmic timeline, we're talking about like most users, right, involved in that experiment. Here, you do an A/B test as you typically do in an industry setting by just like randomly picking user IDs, basically, and then like opting them in or out, right? And so I don't think interference is interference is anyway not a confounder, right? It would be kind of like influencing different experimental units or like coordinating them in some sense, but it wouldn't explain this issue. Yeah.
The tweets themselves as a proxy for the user.
By the way, how much time do I have? Sorry.
I think we're about-
Well, okay, I'm almost done anyway, so let's take that after this. Like, yeah. So we came to believe that there's sort of a catch-22 here when you try to do these observational designs on social platforms. And so it goes something like this, and I'll let you decide if you buy it or not. But this is where I landed. So platforms enable user controls because human behavior is complex and it's hard to predict from observable features. We don't know exactly what people want, so we want to give them choice, right? And we want to give them autonomy because we find it hard to predict what they want and what they do. But then it's exactly this difficulty of predicting user agency and user behavior that makes it hard to deconfound treatment in an observable and an observational study, right? Because what does it mean to like deconfound, right? It means that somehow you can predict treatment from user observables, right? That's exactly sort of what you have to do to deconfound. And that's exactly what it means to predict user behavior from observable features, right? But your inability to do so was the reason why you installed user controls to begin with. So I doubt that it can sort of be done, right? I think there is kind of this kind of catch here. Anyway, so let me just throw out some conclusions. You know, there are all these causal effects of algorithmic algorithms in social systems that we don't understand well. Why is it so hard to understand them? One of my main takeaways is that methodologically, it's not just a micro problem, it's also a macro problem. Like it's not just like sort of something where you can run an RCT and get the full answer from experimental data. There's also like these, you know, these issues of like, how do these causal effects feed into broader dynamics of change on the platform? Like what are sort of the dynamics on the platform that bring about long-term macroscopic changes? And that's just something hard to get at with like A/B tests, right? And so it's a little bit hard to approach this problem without having any sort of like long-term dynamic model of like how Twitter evolves. And if you wanted to have such a model of like how Twitter evolves over time, one extremely important component is what I call micro-foundations for algorithmic decisions, namely this sort of model of like how individuals respond to algorithmic decisions. So if you do some kind of update to the algorithmic timeline, how are people going to adjust to it? Right? That's sort of fundamental to understanding these things. And recently in a paper with Celestine Mendler-Dönner and Mina Jagadisan, we actually argued that what we currently have when it comes to sort of these models of individual behavior to algorithmic decisions is not satisfactory. And this is like one bottleneck, in my opinion, to understanding all of these things. Okay, so specifically for this community, what are some things I would love for you to work on? First of all, take any of these things out on my first slide, any of these supposed causal stories, and come up with formal definitions, conceptual frameworks. How do you define it? How do you measure it? You know, just be sort of more rigorous about the causal mechanisms that we think exist on these platforms, and then try to come up with sort of empirical work, or at least designs, things you would like to see happen to kind of test these causal mechanisms, and sort of provide sort of some guidance to these platforms on like what causal questions do we want to answer as a research community, and you know, similar to what you said, right? What do we want to measure? What do we want to do, right? And so what frameworks do we have for like conducting experiments on platforms, and you know, can we maybe like be a little bit more systematic on like putting forward proposals for what these platforms should do? I think these are all great questions for like a causal inference community like this to think about. All right, and that's all. Thanks. I might be out of time, so we can just. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So let's just talk more on the break. Sorry, I'm ran over.